I hadn't planned on staying at the little hotel. It was more of a last-minute decision than anything. I was exhausted after a long drive through winding roads, and the small town that appeared out of nowhere felt like a safe haven. The hotel stood at the edge of the main street, its pale exterior a little too pristine against the backdrop of the crumbling buildings around it. But something about the place called to me, almost like it had been waiting for me to arrive. The receptionist was an older woman with a cool smile and eyes that never quite met mine. She handed me a key without saying much, just the number 13 etched into the metal. A chill ran down my spine as I took it, though I chalked it up to the fact that I was tired and maybe a bit jumpy. "Room 13, she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "It's a very quiet room, perfect for some rest." I nodded and thanked her, trying to ignore the strange feeling in the air. She didn't seem like she wanted to talk, so I headed upstairs. The hallways were dim, lit only by the faint glow of old-fashioned sconces. When I reached room 13, I stopped for a moment to glance at the door. It was simple, wooden, and unremarkable, except for the number. The key fit smoothly into the lock, and I stepped inside. At first, everything seemed fine. The room was spacious, with an antique four-poster bed and a large cracked window that looked out onto a misty courtyard. But something was off. There was a chill that didn't seem to go away, no matter how high I turned up the radiator. The curtains hung heavy, blocking the view of the outside world completely, and the floorboards creaked under my every step, though I couldn't see anything that might have caused it. I threw my bag onto the bed and tried to relax, but my skin prickled with an unshakable sense of discomfort. After a few minutes, I heard it. A soft tap, 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 as though someone was knocking on the door. I froze, staring at the door, listening. It was faint, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I stood up cautiously, my heart already pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting any visitors. I glanced at the clock, 1:13 a.m. I opened the door slightly, just enough to peek into the hallway. No one. The hotel was quiet, the air heavy with silence. I closed the door and locked it, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the tapping came again, this time louder, like someone was knocking from the inside of the room, not the hallway. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the door, my fingers trembling as I turned the knob. The hallway was still empty. I checked the small closet and under the bed. Nothing. I could feel my heart thudding against my ribs, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I was starting to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing when I heard the tapping again. But this time, it was coming from inside the room. I spun around, wide-eyed. The sound echoed, reverberating from the walls, as though someone or something was trapped behind them, tapping desperately to get out. My feet felt frozen to the floor, yet I couldn't tear my gaze away from the dark corners of the room. Then, the tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence, waiting for the next sound. But when nothing came, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I turned to the bed, but just as I did, I noticed something strange. The curtains, heavy and closed just moments ago, were now swaying gently, as if a breeze had swept through the room. The air felt colder somehow, and my breath misted in front of me, even though the radiator was still on. I walked over to the window, my fingers brushing against the chilled glass. I could see nothing but fog, thick and dense, like the outside world had disappeared. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But the whisper grew louder, rising into a chorus of voices, a hissing sound that echoed inside my skull. "Leave. Leave. Leave," the voices chanted. My blood turned to ice. I whirled around, heart racing, only to find the room unchanged. The bed was undisturbed, the door still locked. Suddenly, the air pressure shifted. It felt like the room was closing in on me. The walls were pressing in, and my chest felt tight as if the room was suffocating me. I ran to the door, desperate to escape, but the knob wouldn't turn. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge. I slammed my body into the door. "Open!" I screamed, panic rising in my throat. But nothing happened. The whispers grew louder. The tapping returned, this time all around me, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, a shadow moved, too fast to be human, just a black shape that flickered and then vanished. I spun around, my heart racing, but when I looked back, I saw a figure standing at the foot of the bed. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide and empty, black holes staring at me. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, just the silent echo of her empty gaze. I stumbled back, falling to the floor, my mind unraveling. The whispers surrounded me, the shadowy figure moving closer with each passing second. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The door clicked open, and the woman was gone. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, my legs weak beneath me. But when I looked down the corridor, I froze. I was standing in front of room 13 again. No, that wasn't possible. I had just left. But I was here again. The door was ajar, the room waiting for me. Before I could react, the door slammed shut in front of me. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched on, an endless loop. There was no way out. The receptionist's warning echoed in my mind. No one leaves room 13. And I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that I never would. I had been on the road for hours, driving through winding back roads, when I spotted it. A hotel perched on the edge of a sleepy little town. The faded sign hanging above the door read, "The Haven." A quaint, older building that seemed to call out to me like a refuge from my exhausting journey. The night was falling fast, and I was beyond ready to rest. The receptionist was an older woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense air about her. She barely looked up from the desk as she handed me a key, her voice soft but strange. "Room 305. It's quiet up there," she said. "You'll want peace tonight." I nodded, though I felt an odd sense of discomfort at her words. Something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. But at that point, all I cared about was sleep. The elevator was old. Its brass doors gleamed faintly under the dim light, and the floor numbers inside looked worn, faded with age. I pressed the button for the third floor, and the elevator creaked to life with a groan. The ride was smooth, but when the doors opened, a strange chill hit me. The hallway was silent, too silent for a hotel, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. The carpet was worn, the wallpaper peeling at the edges, and I couldn't help but notice how empty it felt. The air had a stale quality, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. When I found my room, I pushed the door open, greeted by the musty smell of aged wood and dust. It wasn't much. Old furniture, a bed with a thick quilted blanket, and a small window that overlooked the alley behind the building. I threw my bag on the bed and immediately went to the window to check if the rain had stopped. The air was thick with fog, the alleyway eerily quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off about this place, but it wasn't easy. There was something unsettling about the silence. No TV hums, no people talking in the hallways, just stillness. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour? I opened it cautiously, only to find a young man standing in front of me, dressed in an old-fashioned bellhop uniform. Dark, tailored jacket, a bow tie, and a cap perched neatly on his head. He was a striking figure, almost too pristine for the time-worn hotel. "Evening, sir," he said, his voice oddly polite, his smile too wide. "I've come to offer my assistance with your luggage." "I don't need any help," I replied, slightly annoyed, but not wanting to be rude. The bellhop nodded without hesitation, his smile never faltering. "Of course, but if you need anything at all..." Please don't hesitate to call. I felt his gaze linger just a moment too long before he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. I shut the door and returned to the window, staring out at the dark fog. I tried to push the encounter out of my mind, but there was something unsettling about that bellhop. Something off about his appearance, like he didn't belong in this time. I shook my head. I was tired. I needed sleep. But when I lay down on the bed, something didn't feel right. I could hear faint sounds outside the door, like someone was moving around. But when I got up to check, there was no one in the hallway. The night dragged on, and I found myself tossing and turning in the bed, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I drifted in and out of fitful sleep, and when I finally woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, I sat up, heart racing. I heard them again, heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking toward my room. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the front desk, but the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, expecting a knock, but instead, there was a soft tap on the door, then another, and then a third. I cautiously approached the door and peeked through the peephole, half expecting to see the bellhop again. But when I looked, the hallway was empty, eerily empty. Confused and on edge, I opened the door a crack. There was no one there. I stepped out into the hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The hotel felt like a ghost town, completely still, no sounds at all, just the soft hum of the aging building. I decided to go downstairs to the lobby to get some answers. But as I walked toward the staircase, I saw the bellhop again. He was standing near the elevator, looking straight at me. His smile stretched unnaturally wide. "Is there something wrong, sir?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. "You look a little lost." I shook my head, unsure of how to respond. I wasn't lost. I was just looking for answers. But instead of answering, I turned and hurried toward the staircase, the bellhop's gaze following me the entire way. The lobby was empty. The receptionist was nowhere to be found. I walked around the front desk, searching for some sign of life, but there was nothing. It was as if the entire hotel had swallowed up its occupants. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 3:23 a.m. Just as I was about to turn back toward the stairs, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, this time from behind me. Slowly, I turned. The bellhop was there again, standing in the corner, eyes locked on mine, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice smooth, but carrying an odd weight to it. "Have you found what you're looking for?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. His presence felt suffocating, his unblinking stare piercing straight into me. He wasn't just a bellhop. He wasn't even alive. That's when I noticed the hotel's oldest secret. His uniform was slightly different from the others. His jacket was frayed at the cuffs, and the fabric at his collar was torn. The bellhop's eyes, once full of life, were now hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow every bit of light around him. The whispers began then, faint at first, but growing louder. "Stay! Stay!" they chanted, filling the room. The bellhop's smile stretched wider, his face slowly contorting into something unnatural. "No one ever leaves," he whispered, his voice now a raspy echo. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. But the room was shifting, twisting, shifting out of shape. Every turn I made led me back to the same spot. Every time I tried to step toward the door, I found myself standing in front of the bellhop once again. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The bellhop stepped closer, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I backed into a corner, the hotel closing in around me like a trap, its walls suffocating, its air thick with the scent of decay. "You'll stay here. Forever. Just like all the others," the bellhop's voice echoed. And then I understood. The bellhop wasn't a person. He was a ghost, trapped in an endless loop of servitude, forever bound to the hotel. And now I was next. I was tired, exhausted, really. After a long flight and a rough cab ride, I was grateful to find a hotel that had a room available at such an ungodly hour. The lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only one left in the world. The receptionist gave me a polite smile as she handed me my key. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her voice smooth, almost too polite. "Room 704. It's at the end of the hall." The elevator creaked as it ascended, the doors sliding open with a hesitant shudder when I reached the 7th floor. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit with an amber glow from the sconces on the walls. The carpet beneath my feet was plush, but it had a damp, musty smell that seemed to linger in the air. Room 704 was at the very end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, more out of curiosity than necessity, and stepped inside. The room was spacious, but cold. The walls were draped in dark red velvet curtains, which gave the place a somewhat gothic feel. A large ornate bed dominated the center of the room, its canopy framing the faint light from the lamps on either side. It felt like an old-fashioned room from a different era, like something out of a forgotten time. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I set my suitcase on the bed, suddenly feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. I tried to shake off the sense of unease that crept into my mind. It was just a room, just a place to sleep. I had been traveling for far too long to let a little discomfort get to me. As I settled into the bed, my eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the city was a blur of neon lights and distant traffic sounds, muffled by the thick fog that rolled in off the streets. I pulled the curtains shut, hoping to block out the noise, and lay down to sleep. But then I heard it. At first, it was a faint sound, like a footstep echoing through the hallway. I thought it was just the building settling, but then it came again, closer this time, the unmistakable sound of someone walking toward my door. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't expecting any visitors, and the thought of someone roaming the halls at this hour unnerved me. I sat up and listened. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. A soft knock echoed through the room. I froze. Who could it be? I wasn't expecting anyone. The receptionist hadn't mentioned any room service, and I hadn't called for anything. But I couldn't ignore the knock. It was persistent, deliberate. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle. I opened the door just enough to peek outside, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one in the hallway. Confused and slightly unsettled, I stepped into the hallway, looking both ways. The hall stretched out before me, empty, silent. No one was there. I walked to the end of the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the walls, but I found nothing. The silence was overwhelming. I turned back to my room, chalking it up to my imagination. Maybe I was just too tired, but as I approached the door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A shadow. It was fleeting, a movement at the edge of my vision. Something, or someone, had been standing there. I rushed into the room and slammed the door behind me, my pulse racing. I leaned against the door for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The shadows in the room seemed darker now, as if they were stretching, shifting in the corners of my eyes. I walked to the window again, trying to steady myself. But when I looked outside, the fog had thickened. It pressed against the glass like it was trying to get in. My reflection stared back at me in the darkened window. But something was wrong. There was something else there, a shadowy figure standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air in the room felt heavier now, the temperature dropping. I shivered, tugging the blanket closer around me, but the unease gnawed at my mind. My instinct screamed that something wasn't right, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Then, just as I was about to get up to check the hallway again, I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, almost a whisper coming from behind me. "I'm here." I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the room itself. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the corners of the room. The space felt too small now, as though the walls were closing in on me. Then I saw him. The man in the chair. He was sitting in the corner of the room, in the armchair by the window, facing the bed. His clothes were outdated, an old suit, the kind from the 1920s. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, empty black voids, stared at me with a quiet intensity. He didn't move, didn't blink. I couldn't breathe. My heart slammed against my chest as I took a step back, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. This was impossible. There was no one in the room when I had entered. I had checked. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, watching me, his presence suffocating the air in the room. I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the handle, but when I reached it, I couldn't open it. It was stuck, like the door had suddenly fused with the frame. I turned the knob again, but it wouldn't budge. The room was closing in on me. Then, the man spoke, his voice colder than the air around me. "You can't leave." I stared at him, wide-eyed, my body frozen in place. It felt like the room was spinning, the walls narrowing, the air growing thick with dread. And then I understood. He wasn't alive. He wasn't real. He was a ghost, a prisoner of this place, trapped in the same loop, watching the same scene over and over. The room, the hotel. It was something else entirely, something older and darker than I had realized. "No one leaves," he said again, his voice a raspy echo, "until they understand." The walls seemed to pulse, the shadowy figure growing closer, his smile stretching into something grotesque. My breath came in sharp gasps, my legs giving out beneath me as the room seemed to tilt, the door still refusing to open. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the oppressive silence, and the shadows closed in on me. When I woke, I was lying in the bed. The room was silent, too silent. I looked around, heart racing, unsure if what had just happened was a nightmare. But then I saw it. The chair by the window was empty. The room was exactly as it had been when I first entered. But the air was different. It was thicker now, heavy with something ancient. The door was open, and when I stepped into the hallway, I found myself face to face with the receptionist. "Room 704, she said softly, her eyes never leaving mine. "No one ever leaves." I turned back to the room. It was waiting for me. I didn't expect much from the Ivy Lodge. It was a small budget hotel tucked away in a quiet corner of a town I didn't know, nestled between a run-down diner and a gas station. It looked like one of those places people only stayed in if they had nowhere else to go, or if they were desperate. And I was desperate. The long drive had taken its toll on me. I'd been on the road for hours, driving through winding roads and desolate countryside, looking for a place to rest. My phone had no signal. I was alone. The night was growing late, and I needed to sleep. I pulled into the parking lot and immediately felt the weight of exhaustion hit me. The sign above the door was dimly lit, flickering as though struggling to stay on. The lobby was dark and quiet when I stepped inside, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The receptionist was an older woman, her face expressionless, her eyes too tired to show any emotion. She handed me a room key, saying little more than, "Room 512. It's quiet tonight. You'll have a good rest." Something about her words struck me as odd. Quiet tonight felt too specific, too rehearsed, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to my own overactive mind. I didn't need to overthink it. The elevator ride was long, the old metal doors groaning as they moved. The buttons in the elevator were faded, the numbers almost unreadable, and when I reached the 5th floor, the lights flickered above me. The hallway was dark and narrow, stretching into the shadows ahead. The carpet was worn down, threadbare in places, and the wallpaper peeled at the edges. When I reached my room, room 512, I hesitated for a second, feeling an inexplicable shiver crawl down my spine. There was nothing unusual about the door, just a simple wooden frame with the number 512 in brass. Yet something about it didn't feel right. I opened the door and stepped inside. At first it seemed fine. A basic room with a bed, a small desk, and a worn-out armchair by the window. There was a faint smell of something musty, like old wooden dampness, but it wasn't overpowering. The only thing that struck me as odd was the complete absence of mirrors. No mirror over the sink in the bathroom, no mirror near the bed, no mirrors at all. I shrugged it off. Maybe they were just trying to save money. After all, who needed mirrors in a budget hotel? I unpacked my things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The silence was almost oppressive, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I checked the window. The street below was quiet, the town empty and lifeless under the dim glow of street lamps. The fog outside thickened, turning the world into a dull blur. After a while, I decided to freshen up, so I walked into the bathroom. No mirror. I turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on my face. I stared at the sink, wondering how a hotel could operate without mirrors, and then it hit me. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen myself in one. The thought was disorienting, like something had slipped through the cracks of my memory. When was the last time I'd seen my own reflection? Had I even looked in the mirror before coming to the hotel? I shook my head, trying to brush off the unease that was starting to settle deep in my stomach. It was just a weird hotel, that's all. I had to relax. I turned off the tap and stepped out of the bathroom, but as soon as I turned around, something caught my eye. The chair by the window, the one I had casually tossed my bag onto earlier, was now facing the door. It hadn't been when I walked in. It was almost as though it had moved on its own. I froze. My mind raced to find an explanation. Maybe I had nudged it without realizing it. Maybe the floorboards were uneven. But no, that wasn't it. I had definitely left the chair facing the window. I stepped forward, cautiously approaching the chair, but when I reached out to move it back, I felt an odd sensation, a heaviness in the air, like I was being watched. I quickly pushed it back to where it had been, but the feeling lingered, pressing on my chest. The room felt wrong, stifling. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. Who could be knocking at this hour? I walked toward the door, hesitating for a moment before opening it a crack. There was no one in the hallway, just the dim, flickering lights, casting strange shadows on the walls. I stepped out into the hallway, looking both ways. Nothing. I was alone. I turned back to my room. The door was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that before. I opened it wider and stepped inside, scanning the room again, but everything looked the same. Except for the chair. It was back to its original position, facing the window. I didn't know what to think. My mind was racing now, grasping at fragments of logic, trying to explain away what was happening. I tried to tell myself I was overtired, that I was imagining things. But I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that filled the room. I sat down on the bed, trying to calm myself. I tried to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the unease building in my chest. I reached for the remote control and flicked on the TV. The screen flickered for a second, then settled on static. I turned it off. No use in watching nothing. I looked at the clock instead. It was nearly midnight. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching noise coming from the walls. It was soft at first, like a small animal scurrying along the edge of the room, but it grew louder, more deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving behind the walls. I stood up, my breath shallow, my hands clammy. I walked to the window, trying to steady myself, but the noise didn't stop. It clawed at my nerves, scraping against my skull. And then I heard it, a a soft, whispering voice coming from the wall. "Look at me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see something standing in the room behind me. But there was no one. Just the empty chair, facing the window. The walls were silent. "Look at me." The voice was coming from the chair. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran toward the door, but it slammed shut in my face before I could reach the handle. The room had become a prison, closing in around me. I looked at the chair. The back of it seemed to bend slightly, as though something was shifting within. And then, slowly, a face began to form in the fabric of the chair. It was faint at first, like the outline of a shadow, too vague to be real. But it sharpened, becoming clearer. It was my face. Not my reflection, but my face, twisted into something grotesque, distorted with malice and pain. The eyes, my eyes, were hollow, empty. "Look at me," it whispered again. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was an order. I backed away from the chair, my heart racing. But the face in the fabric didn't stop. It grew, swelling, distorting, reaching out, pulling me in. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall, unable to move, unable to breathe. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was my own face grinning back at me from the chair. I didn't believe in ghosts. At least, that's what I kept telling myself as I drove deeper into the rain-soaked countryside, my headlights cutting through the mist that hung thick in the air. The town I was heading to was tiny, so small that I'd almost missed it entirely. The GPS had pinged out about 5 miles back, and my phone had lost its signal. But I couldn't turn back now. I had to make the check-in for my conference, and I wasn't about to drive all the way back to the nearest city. As I passed the last stretch of farmland, I saw the sign, Willow's End Inn, poking through the fog like an eerie relic from a forgotten time. I pulled into the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. The building looked old, its wooden frame sagging slightly as if it had endured centuries of storms. But it was still standing, and judging by the glowing lights in the windows, it was still operational. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the front door. It opened with a soft creak, and the warmth from inside greeted me, though it had an oddly musty scent to it, like the building hadn't been aired in a long time. The lobby was dimly lit, furnished with heavy, old furniture, tattered couches, faded rugs, and dark wood paneling that absorbed the light. A large chandelier hung overhead, its crystals catching the little light that managed to escape the gloom. Behind the desk was an elderly man, his face drawn and pale, his hair thin and wispy. "Checking in?" he asked, his voice low and raspy, almost too soft to hear over the storm outside. I nodded, pushing forward with my reservation. "Yes, I have a room booked under the name Taylor." The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes shifted over to a ledger on the desk, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages. It was a strange thing to do, considering the place had a computer right behind him, but I wasn't going to question it. "Ah, yes," he said, after a long pause. "Room 315, on the 3rd floor." I raised an eyebrow. "3rd floor? I thought I saw a sign on the building saying only 2 floors. The man's lips twitched, just the slightest hint of a smile. "The 3rd floor is private. Not many go up there." I nodded, confused but not wanting to linger too long. I wasn't in the mood for conversation. He handed me a small brass key, the kind you don't see much anymore. "Enjoy your stay," he said, his voice dipping into an odd, almost imperceptible whisper. "I hope you find what you're looking for." The air in the lobby felt thick now, heavy, but I chalked it up to the storm outside. I turned away, already eager to reach my room and settle in for the night. The elevator was slow, creaking and groaning as it ascended. The walls of the shaft were damp, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, I hesitated. The hallway stretched out before me in long shadows, lit by dim, flickering lights. I couldn't hear a sound, no footsteps, no laughter, not even the hum of the building. I was the only one here. Room 315 was at the far end, and as I walked toward it, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The paintings on the walls, old, faded portraits of people who looked like they belonged in another era, seemed to follow my movements. Their eyes were too real. I opened the door and stepped inside, immediately hit with a cold gust of air. It was colder than I'd expected for the time of year, the chill creeping into my bones. The room was beautiful, if a bit old-fashioned, decorated with dark woods, velvet curtains, and a heavy brass bed frame that looked as though it could have belonged to a queen. But there was something off about it. I turned to the window, drawn to the eerie glow of the storm. The world outside was obscured by thick, swirling fog, making it impossible to see anything beyond the window frame. I tried to shake the feeling of unease that settled in my chest and tossed my bag onto the bed. The storm was intensifying, and it was clear I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Just as I was about to get comfortable, I noticed something strange. There was a large, ornate mirror on the wall opposite the bed. I froze. I hadn't seen it when I entered. In fact, I could have sworn there had been no mirror at all. My stomach tightened as I walked toward it, my reflection appearing in the glass. But there was something wrong. The reflection of the room seemed off. The edges were too blurry, the colors too muted, and the figure standing in the reflection wasn't exactly me. I stepped closer to the mirror, feeling the air grow colder around me. The figure in the glass seemed distorted, as though the reflection was fighting to break free. My face in the mirror twitched, a quick, unsettling movement that wasn't my own. I turned quickly, looking behind me. No one was there. When I looked back, the figure in the mirror had changed. The person standing in it, someone with dark, hollow eyes and a sickly, ashen face, was staring directly at me. I gasped, stumbling backward. The reflection smirked. My heart raced. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. I rushed to the door, desperate to leave, but as I reached for the handle, the lights above me flickered. The mirror in front of me grew darker, the image of the figure growing clearer, more pronounced. It smiled again, this time wider, its teeth sharp and jagged. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice low and distorted. I spun around, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, frantic, but it was stuck, locked tight. The mirror behind me gleamed now, its surface rippling like water, as though the figure inside was trying to reach out. The lights flickered again, and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. It was right behind me. I spun, but I couldn't see anything in the pitch black. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears, the feeling of being surrounded by something unseen overwhelming me. Then, the lights blinked back on, just for a second. The mirror was gone. In its place was a dark, twisted version of the room, a reflection of something distorted, as if the room had been broken. It was no longer the room I had entered. The walls had splintered, the floor cracked, and the window was black, no longer letting in any light, no longer reflecting the outside world. And standing in the center of the room, just beyond the threshold of the mirror, was the figure, smiling, its eyes black and hollow, stretching toward me. "You're trapped now," it whispered again. I screamed and stumbled back, only to find myself falling into the mirror itself. I reached out, trying to grab the doorframe, trying to pull myself back to reality, but my fingers slipped through the glass like it was water. The last thing I remember is hearing the old man's voice in my head. "I hope you find what you're looking for." And then everything went black.